Okay, so in this clip, we are trying to advance further to the territory of virtue theory. We have already seen very elaborately, at least, how decision making happens in the case of deontology and utilitarianism. Now, virtue theory is one of the earliest theoretical frameworks that we have with us, and it starts with the philosopher named Aristotle. And it will be difficult to really talk about virtue theory separately by ignoring Aristotle's larger ideas, okay, larger philosophical system. So, uh, to keep the simplicity, however, I am going to link some of these ideas that Aristotle propounded with his larger philosophy. So he starts with the fact that, at least in the worldview of the ancient Greeks, uh, the fact that everything in this universe that exists has got a purpose in its life, in its sustenance. Okay, and in the case of human beings, the purpose, okay, of life as to why we are here is related to the idea of becoming virtuous. Okay, so Aristotle mentions several virtues such as wisdom, courage, fortitude, liberality, and so on and so forth. And there are contexts, both professional as well as personal context, where people can be virtuous. Okay, so how do we really imagine Aristotle's virtue theoretical framework? And one good way to start is by imagining normal metaphysical issues such as properties and entities. So here you have a bare, some kind of entity, bare, say, substrata, or some entity without any properties at T1. Imagine, say, for example, the birth of a baby. The moment it comes into existence, it has got a body, it has got some kind of consciousness, but very minimal. And as time progresses, the baby or the substrata, the entity, starts to acquire properties and attributes. Okay, so very similar to the way we have entities in the world, and as they sustain in their existence, they start to gain more and more properties. Okay, so Aristotle claims these properties or attributes as virtues. Okay, so at time t n k, t n plus k, we have a set of attributes to the entity. So this is how typically in metaphysics we imagine properties and entities, that there is some sort of bare entity that takes in attributes as it progresses. So for example, now we have this bottle here, and the bottle is actually a bare entity with the color blackness. So once it is there, it starts to have properties, and it can contain water, it's another property. It's heavy, it's another property, and so on and so forth. So in this way, if we try to imagine human existence, what happens is that we all know, in a certain sense, that existence is at least conceptually prior to predication of attributes or predication of properties. Okay, now in some examples it's true with almost all artificial objects as well as natural objects. Say for example, when I say the apple is red, it's the apple that comes into our mind first, and redness is a quality or a property or an attribute that's predicated. Pause for a moment and ask, is the apple really red? Okay, so that's how we can sort of separate properties with the entity. Now, redness happens because of it being in a particular context. Human beings perceive that kind of frequency in the optical spectrum, and it's a whole lot of physics there that explains that the apple has this property, redness. It's being in that context that it is red. For an animal that's colorblind, or a human being that's colorblind, the apple may not be red, but in the context, the apple has got that property. So, and in, as the apple advances, sustains in its life, it may have other properties like ripeness, etc., etc. So, very similar to the life of human beings, the apple's life gets meaning by acquiring more and more properties into its core, or the entity, as we call it. So we are born, so existence happens, and then we all of a sudden think after a while, and I'm talking about 10 or 20 years, once we make sense of the world, we start to acquire properties like wisdom, courage, okay, confidence. These are all virtues, okay. And for Aristotle, the purpose of life depends on fulfilling certain virtues that are part of a context, okay. And I'm going to explain how he sort of does justice to this worldview. So this is how we can imagine. Say, for example, a baby is born. Here we have a couple of babies at T1. It's an empty set. There is nothing really there other than, say, a minimal level of consciousness and a minimal level of perception. And the baby is really helpless. It needs help by others and it needs care, so on and so forth. As we progress, there is maybe in, say, 10th year or so, Aristotle says it may pick certain virtues, certain properties, similar to the case of an entity that picks property like an electron or a proton. Okay, these dispositional properties make the individual or the baby in this context act in a certain way. Okay, so these properties are added in our mind, and these properties then, as we know, these are virtues, guide us in certain situations as to behave in a particular way. So here, this is my own example, so you can replace it with anyone's. Say, for example, just in this case, in this baby, just assume in this baby's case, is assume that it picks honesty. Honesty comes in at tn plus k. Patience comes in, and tn plus k plus m. Something else, say care, comes in, and so on and so forth. After 30 years or so, or 25 years or so, they become full grown-ups. Okay, not just the visual properties, okay, the properties of the object, but also the properties of the mind. So Aristotle is talking about these properties of the human mind. Okay, so we are not talking about tall or short, or how much mass or things like that, but virtuous attributes. Okay, so contexts are important in deciding what virtues are available and what virtues are good in a particular individual's case in that context. So similar to the apple acquiring redness in the human visual field, a baby, for example, if it is say traversing time, and then it speaks loyalty, and then at tn plus k it picks something else, that's like, say, courage, and it goes on to pick, say, courage and honor, and so on and so forth. Aristotle says, oh, here is an individual that's contextually suitable for becoming a soldier. Okay, so these are the virtues that a soldier should have. So it's loyalty, courage, honor, valor, and so on and so forth. The virtue of putting one's own life before the life of others. So many philosophers give this example of a soldier jumping ahead to take a bullet, to save someone else, something of that sort. So these are virtues that are available in that context, but it is cultivated in individuals as they progress in time. Okay, and these are cultivatable. So when obviously it's clear that when we are born, we don't really have these properties. Okay, so in a similar way, we can say that doctors, lawyers, people who are teachers and so on, each of these contexts prescribe certain virtues, and the the game is in really acquiring those virtues. Okay, so acquiring those virtues will help us behave in the correct way. So, as an example, we go back to the Greek thought process, the whole philosophy behind, purpose of existence, meaning of life, etc. Now, the Greeks believed that not just Aristotle, but a whole lot of others along with him, his teacher and his, disciples, the meaning of life is uh, in fulfilling these virtues. And here is the example from the movie Troy. If you remember both the speeches given by Hector as well as Achilles, and in here it's Brad Pitt, but in the actual scenario, the character of Achilles gives a speech before getting onto the beach and conquering Troy, says that, there is a bit of implicit Greek philosophy available in that. It's not explicitly available in the script, but if you read through the script, you will see that. For Aristotle, courage is an ultimate virtue the soldier should have, and the bravery that that a soldier shows in battle, and while showing that bravery or courage, if the soldier is killed, let's assume, then Aristotle says that through that act of valor, the soldier acquires immortality. Okay. In the same way, Plato also has said that there are universal forms, and human beings are always in search of objective universal forms. And the taste of mathematics is immortality in that sense, because we are trying to know what is eternal, right? 2 plus 2 is equal to 4 is an eternal truth. So we are tasting that. And in the same way, Plato claims that beauty is an eternal form, and pursuit of beauty, the eternal form of beauty, through these available beautiful objects around us, it's also a taste of immortality. That's why people are after beauty, after mathematics, after courage, and after war, because these things sort of brings in a taste of immortality. So this whole speech by Achilles is, tangentially touching upon virtue theory, where, being virtuous, and in this particular context of a soldier being courageous, makes him or her, taste immortal, eternal sort of concepts. And that's the whole purpose of life, right? And according to both Plato and Aristotle, the purpose of life is in elevating our mere standard of life as an animal, okay, from sort of moving this standard of life as an animal to a much more eternal and divine, so to speak. Plato claims that human beings is midway between animals and the gods. So we are trying to become like gods and reach for it by tasting mathematics, tasting beauty, tasting these virtues. Okay, and that's the whole meaning of life available to us. There is nothing else to really aim for. Okay, so this is a small snippet that you have, that I've added to, related to the larger context of Greek philosophy. Now, Aristotle gives multiple virtues, and you don't have to really learn all this. But the crucial point in here is that all of these are part of a spectrum. Okay, so between rashness and cowardice, we have courage. Okay, so that's the golden mean theory by Aristotle, that we go for the middle path, the golden mean, and say we have between shyness and shamelessness, we have modesty. So the correct virtue is the one in the middle, not the excess, not the deficient. Okay. And if you sort of search for in the internet, you will see a lot of these frequency type of excess as well as deficient virtues, and the one in the middle is the right one and the right virtue that we should aim for, so that our lives are made meaningful. Okay. Now, going on to the contextual issues, obviously you might have already had in your mind about conflict of virtues. For example, what's the right virtue to have in a particular context may depend on uh, something that's more valuable to you. Okay. So conflict of virtues often happens in this way, that sometimes we say that humility is the right virtue, we should be modest, humble, and so on and so forth. But at other contexts we also say that there's nothing wrong in being proud about one's achievements, being proud about one's self. Okay. So you may have contexts where the virtues are in conflict with each other. Okay. And people might also say that there's no need to be really shy, but then people may also say that shamelessness is a virtue sometimes, but shamelessness is not always a virtue in certain contexts. In the same case goes with shyness. Okay. And there are other virtues where the extremities become virtuous at certain point of time. So this is one way to open up the issue, that within the frequency, the mean and the excess and the deficient, there may be conflicts in different contexts. Okay. So it is virtuous to become proud of oneself in a particular context, but it would be equally non-virtuous to become proud of oneself in another context. Okay. So that's one issue with the virtue theory. The other issue is about the contextual scenario, leading us to two separate sort of contexts, subcontexts, so to speak, personal as well as professional. Okay. So how do we really rate them? Should we rate the personal virtues such as loyalty to a friend, okay, more than our loyalty to a firm, or our sincerity to a firm? Now these are open-ended issues. Okay. Aristotle claims that the way we put hierarchy of virtues depends on a thought, and that thought is, how do we really want a context to unfold, and in that context what sort of a person do we really wish to become? Okay. So it's not like what I will do. Okay. I mean, in a particular context, we as virtue theorists think in this fashion: how do we really want that episode to unfold? Okay. We talked about cases of accidents and decision making in the case of a old friend, etc. What sort of episode we want there to happen, and what sort of an I should be there. Okay. If I put myself in that context, what kind of virtues should be there? So we do a kind of in the method of reasoning related to virtue theory, what do we need to do is to look for contextual virtues in, say, for example, in professional situations we talk about safety, confidentiality, etc. And most of these professions put the codes, those are virtues, above the personal virtues that we value. Okay. So imagine a case where a lawyer and his wife are discussing something over a coffee, and suppose that his or her spouse, the partner, asks, "Oh, is that person really a culprit?" Because the lawyer knows the truth, but should the lawyer really disclose it to his or her wife, or sorry, his or her spouse? According to Aristotle, the contextual virtue in this case that dominates is that even if it's his wife or his or her spouse that is asking for information, the integrity of the lawyer comes above his or him being a human being with a partner in life. Okay, so confidentiality is rated above loyalty to his or her spouse. So the context unfolds in a certain way, as I said, and you should be able to imagine what sort of a human being I should be if I am in that context. Okay, and the same goes with engineers and soldiers and so on and so forth. Given a chance, what sort of a decision should I take? This depends on what sort of a context I am in, number one, and what sort of a virtue I should envisage, is appropriate for that context. So this is typically known as counterfactual thinking. And in counterfactual thinking, what we do is we imagine a scenario where certain factors are available, and we will think or say sort of simulate, okay, or do a kind of thought experiment by putting certain virtues in place and a person there. So ask the question, in this case, the case that we discussed about a case of accident on the way to airport, what sort of a person would you like to see in such a situation? Okay, and bring in all the virtues, both personal, professional, etc., and then just make a set of virtues that are available and put a person there, imaginary. See what he or she would do. Now, would you like to see a person with courage, temperance, and kindness there at the place of accident, or would you like to see a person who is a coward, who doesn't want to stay there because he has some other engagement, and a person who is not that kind, probably is kind in other contexts, but is not having enough courage to be kind at that particular context, and a person who is insensitive, etc., etc. So now, if we have this contextual analysis with counterfactual thinking, we know for sure that we would need someone who stops for help, because in this counterfactual thinking, you might even put yourself in the subject who met with an accident. Okay, so if we were the persons who were in that accident, and if we were bleeding, we wouldn't want this person to approach us there. We would want this kind of a person to really come and help us. So from the point of view of the victim, as well as the point of view of a general public or a general audience, we want this person to approach that scene. Okay, now utilitarians will disagree. Utilitarians might just say that, hang on, we will first discuss what are the consequences, and if the consequences are beneficial to a larger lot by being a coward, then maybe it's fine. Maybe it's fine to skip the scene. Okay, they may just say that, but they have a quantitative way of doing that. Okay, so and you can sort of apply this in other contexts as well, the context that I discussed, and we will bring in more examples. Now, there is a reason why I introduced virtue theory at this point, because virtue theory is the link to the codes of ethics that we talked about, in line with the Washington Accord for engineers. Okay, and also it sort of opens up a lot of debates about what is responsibility and how do we look at each situation where moral dilemmas are available. Okay, so more on the next clips, but for the time being, imagine virtue theory in this way that uh, don't think about consequence as utilitarians, or don't think about universal objective laws, but think about the properties that you would want to see in an individual in that context. Okay, so then um, push in those properties imaginarily in that individual, play with those properties, put different properties and see how the individual is going to behave in that context. Okay, and the same goes in professional life as well, whether you're an employee or an employer or some sort of service provider. Think what sort of virtues that you would really want to see in your employee or in yourself in that context. Okay.